Good morning, West Portal. Welcome to week 2 of the series we're kicking off our new year with, God Has a Name, based on the book by the same title by pastor and author John Mark Comer. And it's just a disclaimer, again, we're borrowing extensively from his work in this regard. If you were with us last Sunday, we kind of opened with what we said is what comes into our minds when you and I think about God may turn out to be the most important thing about us. We don't tend to think that, but it may well be true. And in part, it's because our lives will be powerfully shaped, more than we would probably care to admit, by our image or perception of who God is. I'll layer that one more today, and I'll say this will also have a direct impact on the kind of relationship that you and I have or don't have with God. And just a handful of examples, and I think I have some pictures there, we'll see how they show up. But like, if what comes into your mind when you think about God is like a lightning-wielding tyrant in the sky, that's going to impact the kind of relationship that you do or don't have, right? If God is inherently violent, always looking for the next, people group to like wipe out, it's going to impact the way you perceive the kind of him and the kind of relationship you have. I grew up in the 80s and comedies of that particular, generation in movie form. If there ever was like a school teacher or school principal, they were always like this caricature of this, I am watching for the next misstep that you take so I can pounce, McFly, right? And so like whatever it is, but like if that's how you view God, that's going to impact the relationship you have. And for many of us at a subconscious level, when we think of God, we actually just think God is a little bit distracted and preoccupied with more important things than us. I can't imagine how much time and energy it takes to run the events of the universe and of countries and all this kind of stuff. And we kind of feel like we're the nagging voice that God keeps saying, shoo. It's going to impact the kind of relationship that you have with God. One of the things we said last Sunday in our opening is that maybe this is good news. It's bad and good news. The conclusions that we draw about who God is and what he's like are often wrong. Often wrong, and so what we can do, though, is we can go back to the source, and it's why we're parking here for several Sundays in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. It's one of the few places, if not the only place in the Bible, where God essentially issues a worldwide tweet. He says, you want to know who I am and what I'm like? Here it is. And so last Sunday we said, and it begins with a name. God introduces himself, so to speak. He says, Yahweh, Yahweh. The name means I am. Who God is, you can count on him to be. There's a constancy, a consistency that you can depend on, the character and personality of this God to be consistent in this way. And two of the implications that we drew from this, one is that this means God is inherently relational. God wants to know and be known by his creation. And because because relationships are dynamic, what we discover is God interacts genuinely with his people. And the disclaimer is appropriate again. Like, there's mystery to this. I get it. God's not a formula. I get it. But the story of the God that we read in scriptures is of one who genuinely interacts with his people. And we referenced, at least in passing, Exodus chapter 32, the story of the golden calf. God is the God who is slow to anger, gets angry. He is frustrated. He is about to judge Israel very harshly. And Moses gets into this strange back and forth conversation with God. And the punchline is that God relents. We're going to talk about this word again. We're going to look at another story this morning where God relents. It means to regret a decision and to change one's mind. God changes his mind when it comes to the nation of Israel. And as we continue to unpack this, I'm looking forward to it because I think this will continue to change or impact not just what we think about God and how we talk about God, but it's going to impact the way we start to engage and relate to talk with this God. So we're going to the next section. We're walking through this very slowly, but because it's a short 2 verses, and just to kind of keep the whole in mind, can we fire these up? Do we have them in there? Read this with me again, and then we'll talk about the next piece. The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. You know, reading that with a wooden spoon up here is a traumatic experience. Let's put that down. By the way, and I acknowledged this last Sunday, I get it, the last few lines will be the elephant in the room. You'll have to live in tension. We're going to get to that in February, all right? We're going to keep walking through this just sequentially. Now, here's the deal. In Hebrew, order matters. The order that things come to, or come to you in, matter. When you and I read this these two verses, I don't know if you're like me, what I read is, here's an assorted list of characteristics of God, and just mentally I just go, oh, and they're all true and they're all equally important. It's just that's who God is. That's not the way a Hebrew person would read this list. How many of you have ever filled out like one of those personality profiles? You know, leadership assessment tools, like one of these kind of profile things. What you understand if you've ever filled one of those out is that it'll say like, so here's a list of the different character traits that are all represented in you, but uniquely. And some you have like a lot of. They're dominant in your life, and others are not as dominant. That would be the way a Hebrew would read this list. So when God says, and he begins by saying, I am compassionate and gracious, you and I are being informed, this is, when it comes to God's character, it's not that these others aren't true, but this is the dominant component of his personality. More than any others, this is what shapes and influences his character and then his interaction with his human creation. We're going to see that in some of the stories that we look at later on. But for now, order matters. Compassionate and gracious, I was trying to figure out how to pronounce Rachum Rachanan or something like that in Hebrew. At the very least, it's a good excuse to clear one's throat. Rachum, by the way, it's a word pairing in Hebrew, which means the words are often used together. They kind of complement and fill out the meaning, and you'll see that as we walk through it. So Rachum is a feeling word. It's translated here as compassionate. It's actually most dominantly translated in your Old Testament as merciful. So keep that in mind. When you see the word merciful, oftentimes it's the same word that's also translated compassion. And it comes from a Hebrew root word that means female womb. You go, what? It's actually not as weird as we think. It's a word picture for the kind of deep feelings of a mother toward her child. Now, what I do find interesting is when you and I are asked to describe God, the first words that come to mind aren't like woman, womb, or feeling. Right? It's the first thing that God says when he describes himself. So quirky story, just to make this point. This is found in 1 Kings chapter 3. I'm just referencing it. If you want, you can look it up later. It's a great little story. Two women are fighting over whose baby, whose child this is. Like there's one child, two women. One says it's hers, the other says it's hers. In the ancient world, you can't just do a DNA test to solve the problem. And their case goes somehow all the way up to the king. Solomon is the one that's there, brilliant individual. And so he says the following, and it sounds really, really horrible and insensitive, but he just turns to one of the soldiers nearby. He says, just go cut the baby in half and give half to each. Because what he understands is the minute he does this, it's going to do something in the real mother's heart, which is how the story unfolds. She was deeply moved with compassion. And her first response is just give the baby to the other lady. Like, doesn't matter, just let my child live. This is how God feels, friends. There is something deep and in the bloodstream about the way God feels about you and me. For those of you that are parents, you can this will tap into something in your heart. Like of all the feelings of connection, of love, of devotion, whether it's of like, you could talk about romantic love of a man for a woman, or of a soldier for their country, or of a World Cup fan for their team, or whatever it is, you kind of understand that at its heart, there is something in a parent's heart that's just more than all of these others. We will do crazy, irrational, self-giving things for our children because of what we feel in our hearts. A disclaimer is in order here. for some of you, and here's the beautiful thing about being a child or being a parent in both of, they give us these wonderful partial glimpses into who God is and to kind of the way that he interacts with us. But all of us are imperfect in that regard, and some of you have had very, very poor experiences or examples. And tragically, I'll just be honest, some of you can't wrap your head around this because your experience with an earthly parent was anything but compassionate and gracious. It may have been tremendously critical. It may have been absent, or worse, it may have involved abuse. And if that's your story, one, I'm deeply sorry. And two, you will have to wrestle with whether you're willing to come to a spot that you will trust that the Creator God that we find in the pages of Scripture is different than the experience and the example that you've been given as a parent. But for now, Rahum is a feeling word. It's how God feels. And it pairs with Hanun, which is an action word. And it means to show favor or to show grace. It's a pairing because if it starts as a feeling, I am moved towards another, or my children in particular. This is the companion that says, and I'm willing to take steps to come alongside to practically do something about the situations that they find themselves in. Example of this, Psalm 86. Do you have that for me, Sarah? Psalm 86, so one of the things I said last Sunday is the Psalms often are these uncut, uncensored prayers. They feel really disrespectful to us. We're very uncomfortable with many of them. It turns out God just thinks this is a really honest way to talk with him. He's actually quite okay with this. This is Psalm 86, it says it's a prayer of David. I'm picking up a little bit towards the end of the psalm. But David starts, he goes, arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people, the word literally means violent, are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you. We're not given much beyond this for context, but David's life is in jeopardy. If you know anything of the backstory of David, that's not hard to imagine. Spends many years hiding, literally in fear for his life. David can't control his circumstances, but David knows the character of God. Now watch. He falls back on Exodus 34. But you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Exodus 34, he claims it. This is who you say you are. And then he kind of wraps up and he says, turn to me and have mercy. It's have grace or show grace to me. And in this case, it's a plea for help, right? Give me strength and save me. God's graciousness is a desire to help. And this is David's prayer. It's a prayer for God's graciousness to be on full display. And it says, help, save me, come to my rescue. And these two words come together, the feeling that is evoked and the desire to come alongside and do something about it, that God says is the most dominant personal characteristic of his personality, compassionate and gracious. Now, this brings me to the passage I'm really excited to talk about. I love this story. I mean, honestly, like the top two Sunday school stories of all time, David and Goliath and what would you say? Yeah, it's a whale of a tale. Yeah, okay, you know where we're going. It for sure is in the top three. Yes, so here's how it starts. I'm going to assume some familiarity on your part with the story, but I want to set the table here. So here's how the book opens. The word of the Lord, Yahweh, came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from Yahweh and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from Yahweh. So a couple of things that are interesting here. So Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, was the dominant empire of that day, and kind of the arch enemy of every other people group kind of in and around the Mesopotamian area. I was doing a little bit of reading about the Assyrians because I was reading the Old Testament book of Isaiah this past fall, and the threat of the Assyrian army coming is the backstory to much of what the dynamics that are happening politically in the country of Israel at the time. What you need to know, just for the sake of shortening this, is even by ancient world standards, the Assyrians' cruelty and brutality was like the stuff of legend. Like, these guys were inventive in their torture techniques. They loved to kill people by impaling them. That was a favorite way to do it. If that sounds quick like a spear, it wasn't. They would hang and suspend the body with a spike just kind of up under the torso and let your body weight slowly drive that into you. They would peel the skin off their victims and hang it on their city walls, on their palaces. Like, So like decapitations, eyes gouging, chains through jaws, children burning, you name it, this was normal for the Assyrian people. More importantly, they did this on purpose. They would brag about it. They would advertise it. They wrote about it. We have ancient texts that outline the torture techniques that different kings chose to employ. Why? Because they understood the value of psychological warfare. You thought long and hard about standing up to the Assyrian army because you knew what happened to people who tried to do that and failed. Which is why the book of Isaiah, there's all sorts of political, like, I think we should reach out to Egypt. No, we should just surrender. God says, trust me. They're like, are you kidding? It's the Assyrians. Legitimate issue. So I don't doubt that to some degree, there is a fear factor here for Jonah. When God says, go to Nineveh, this is not the place like you go like, yeah, let's plant a church in that neighborhood. There's got to be a different place we could park. But what I want you to notice is this. Okay? Actually, there's a humorous piece in here if you know your geography. I'll turn around for a minute so I pretend I'm looking at the map the way you are. But if we're in Israel, Nineveh is a few days' journey up to the north and the east. Tarshish is to the west. It's across the Mediterranean on the coast of Spain. It would have been arguably the last known city kind of in the ancient world. So God says, go to Nineveh. Jonah literally does a 180 and heads to the ancient equivalent of Timbuktu. It's like, that'd be a no. I'm going in this direction. What's really interesting is this, though, and we should keep this in mind. While I don't doubt that there is some fear factor going on, the text says not that Jonah's running away for fear, and it doesn't say that he's running away from the Assyrians or the Ninevites, but that he's running from Yahweh. And it's an odd expression, and we actually have to wait to the end of the story to find out the reason for this. So now I'm going to fast track through the story. I'm going to assume some familiarity. God sends, Hurricane Jonah to touch down on the Mediterranean. Jonah is thrown overboard. He becomes, is it reverse sushi? What do you call what a fish eats? Anyway, the fish has digestive issues, right? He is, and Jonah's like, please, let's not go through that again. I'll go. And so he eventually travels to Nineveh. And I think it says it takes him 3 days to preach through the city. And he gets up on his soapbox and he preaches a one-line sermon, which my wife continues to tell me I should do here. She says, if you just, Jesus wins. Dunk. It'd be really powerful. It would save a lot of time in prep. I'll maybe do that one Sunday. This is Jonah's one-line message. He gets up on the soapbox. He's like, 40 days, guys, and Yahweh's going to destroy you. Goes to the next soapbox corner, climbs up. You guys, 40 days, Yahweh, you dead meat. Punk. And he works his way through the city this way. And when you have a little bit of a sense of the backstory of the Ninevites and the Assyrians, the response is astonishing. But the city repents. The king gets off his throne, declares a stat holiday, and not for partying. It's for mourning. We are going to repent. People are clothing themselves in rough, coarse sackcloth as a demonstration of the repentance in their hearts. And we get to this awesome verse. This is at the end of chapter 3. Let's see if I can find this now. Yeah, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented. There's that word again. And he did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. God changed his mind. He said, this is what I was going to do, but because of how you have responded, I'm not going to do it. Now, this is where the Sunday school story ends, and it's a little bit of a pet peeve. I know why we do it. But if you end the Sunday school story here, the story becomes either about Jonah, don't run away from God, he'll get you. Or it becomes about Nineveh, you'd better repent, or God's going to get you. And there's merit to both of these points, but I want to suggest neither is the primary point of the book in the story of Jonah. But you have to get to chapter 4 to figure out what it is. And here's where we come. By the way, Jonah has just had a response to his one-sentence message that would make Billy Graham jealous. It's like, dude, I need to take preaching lessons from you. You would expect Jonah to be overjoyed, but he's not. He is ticked. He is grade A PO'd at Yahweh. And this is what we find at the tail end. So here's chapter 4. Jonah goes, this is why I ran away to Tarshish. And think about that for a minute. This should jog your memory back to chapter 1, verse 3. He ran away from Yahweh. This is why I ran away, Jonah vents. Somehow, his worst fears have come to pass. What? Now watch this. This is so good. He throws Exodus 34 right back in God's face. This is why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Dang it! It's so honest, and it's tragically funny, and there's dark irony. Jonah is ripping mad at God. Why? Because God is compassionate and gracious, not just with us, but with everyone, which includes our enemies. And there is something in all of us that wants God's compassion and grace for our lives, but there are people who we want God's justice for. And this is Jonah's complaint. By the way, I'm going to rabbit trail for just a little bit here. I think it's so important that we keep some of these stories alive because they give us a balancing narrative. There's a lot of hypersensitivity, both in Christian circles and non-Christian circles today, about the violence, about the justice and punishment that we read about God bringing on people and people groups in the Old Testament. And I get it. They're hard passages to read. I'm not here to suggest I have easy answers for you. But we read these stories of God's punishment, and we go, wow, that's so offensive. But what we don't ever talk about is how offensive God's compassion and grace can turn out to be. Jonah understood this, but let me give you a different example just to make this point. And I referenced the story of God befriending Abraham last Sunday. God comes to Abraham. He says, I know you don't have any kids, but your family tree is going to be epic. There's going to be nations coming from you. I'm going to take you to this new land. And it's this little obscure passage. It's found in Genesis 15. And God essentially says the following to Abraham. He says, but I'm not ready to give you that land yet because the sin of its people hasn't quite reached the spot where I'm willing to respond to it. It's going to take me 400 years before I'm ready to do something about this. And in the we go, God, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God. This is wonderful. He is slow to anger. But who pays the price for the bulk of those generations while God is being compassionate and gracious to the Canaanite territories and cities as well as to Egypt? And the answer is Abraham's family and everybody else who is oppressed and in poverty and in slavery and watching their babies get thrown into the Nile River. 4 generations of God's compassion and grace to people. We go, oh, it's wonderful. But by God being slow to anger means others are paying the price for that injustice in the meantime. We don't talk about that. But if you were an Israelite, you would say Yahweh is being very, very unfair. And it's every bit as offensive. We want God to act. That's offensive. When he doesn't act, it's equally offensive. It's just to a different people group. And this is what Jonah feels, and I think I just want to acknowledge that you and I all have a little bit more of Jonah in us than we would care to admit. We love the idea of Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, but as long as he's selective with kind of his administration of that. But he's not, because Yahweh implies consistency. This is how he will be with everyone. Now, we said last Sunday, and James already hinted at this in his prayer this morning, that Jesus is Yahweh, embodied in human form. So we would expect to find this character trait all over the life and teachings of Jesus. I'll give you just a couple of examples of this. Sermon on the Mount, surprise, surprise. We walked through it this fall. I'm going to reference it a lot. One of Jesus' more controversial kind of sound bites from that sermon is his statement on enemy love. He starts with, you have heard it said, love your neighbor, right? Those who are near you, those who are like you. And we go, yeah, okay, I can do that. And hate your enemy. We go, yeah, I like this God. I'm on board with this. And he goes, but I say to you, you've got it wrong. It's not the heart of your Father. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Now, I don't know what kind of trauma or hurt you've experienced in your life from other people. Like if I think on kind of I haven't much. Like, this is 2.4 on a scale of 10. Like when I think about enemy love and trauma and whatever else, like I haven't experienced a lot. And I struggle to pray for people who have hurt and wronged me or taken advantage of me. Pray for those who persecute you. You have to love Jesus. As hard as his teachings are, he puts his money where his mouth is. You guys remember this prayer? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. on the cross, bleeding out, in agony, gasping for breath, Jesus prays for people who spit in his face, for people who beat him, for people who will reject and hate him, for people who will mock him, for people who will never respond to the offer of salvation that he's there making possible. Why? Because this is the dominant character trait of our God. Probably the most well-known parable that Jesus ever speaks, and we call it the parable of the prodigal son. It's found in Luke chapter 15. I'll give you kind of the short form version of it. It involves a father and two of his boys. It doesn't take long to figure out that the father is intended to be a picture of Yahweh, right? So you have one son that's wild and brash, the other that's kind of, snooty and a little bit self-righteous. And the brash son comes to his dad and he says, "Dad, I'd really like my inheritance early," which in an ancient culture of honor and shame is the equivalent of saying, "Dad, you really should hurry up and die." It's a tremendous insult. Of all the responses we would expect the father to have, the one that he does have is the one that we wouldn't expect. And he just says, "Okay, I can make that happen for you." And the wild son becomes a world-traveling party animal, wine, women, and song. He lives out kind of what the anthem of every 80s rock song was that I grew up listening to. That's just his life. But the party comes to a crashing halt as the money in his wallet runs out, and he finds himself in abject poverty. He's working to feed pigs as a way of trying to scrape together a few coins to live. He's like sneaking bites of the pig's food on the side, knowing he shouldn't even be doing that. You and I, that's a low rung for you and me. If you're a Jewish person, that's the bottom of the barrel. I don't think it gets lower than that. And the boy comes to his senses. He's like, "What am I doing? I'm going to go home. I'm going to ask for my dad's forgiveness. What's the worst that can happen? I'm living it. If I'm lucky, my dad will take me back as a hired hand. It'll be so much better a life than what I have here." And so the boy heads home. Do you remember the punchline of this parable? While he was a long way off, the father sees him and has what? Compassion. This son has done everything in his power to break his dad's heart. He has done everything in his power to wreck and to permanently rend that relationship, but you can't get rid of the feeling of a parent for their kids. And we would watch the next part in slow motion, right? A little St. Elmo's fire there or something. But the father runs to his son and he embraces him and he puts a coat on him. He says, "Put the tenderloin in the smoker. We are going to party." This is the compassion and grace. This is a picture of Yahweh. And it's beautiful. And what I really want you to see from this is that, and it's not just that Jesus brings this somehow. It's in and throughout the Old Testament too. God is constant in this regard. What do we do with this? I'll leave you with two ideas, just layering a little bit on some of the conversation we had last Sunday. One of the things I mentioned was the names. What we call other people and what they call us speaks volumes of the relationship that we do or don't enjoy. So there are relationships that we have that we use very respectful, deferent kind of language for, and there are others that are deeply intimate, that it'd be only appropriate for you to use those words or those names with one or two people, right? There's a reason for this. And Jesus says the primary way that his followers should and can approach Yahweh is as our Father. And I know this hasn't been everybody's experience of an earthly parent, but it's a picture of safety and of trust and of vulnerability and of intimacy. The author of Hebrews, picks up on some of the Sinai reference. I'd love to share this with you. It's in Hebrews chapter 4, and he writes the following there. "Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may," and here's the echoes of Sinai, "that we may receive mercy," compassion, "and find grace," an action word, "to help us in our time of need." Until they are taught otherwise, a child's natural approach to their parents is with confidence. Kids don't naturally bow and grovel at your feet or kiss your shoes or cry and run and hide in the corner. They come and they throw themselves at you. In fact, I was just thinking this past week, this was a number of years ago, but I have a nephew, his name is Caleb. He loves to live life at like 100 miles an hour. He is only happy when he is doing something at speed that risks life and limb. And he was a toddler at the time. We were at my parents' place visiting, like it was Christmas. I was standing, my back was to the living room. And as I started to torso twist a little, I realized that he had climbed up to the top of the back of the sofa and full on launched himself at me. I was like, wah! And he wasn't trying to tackle me, and he hadn't given me a word of warning. One, he just loves to fly. And he doesn't think, what might the consequences of this be? I don't think that registers anywhere in his mind. But here's the deal. He loves to fly, and his experience with his father is one of compassion and grace. Dad catches me. And if Dad catches me, Uncle Andrew will too. I didn't drop him. I don't know if I caught him particularly well, but he didn't hurt himself nobody was harmed in the making of this story. I just found myself thinking about that because, and I'll just leave you with this. When you and I come to the conclusion, by which I mean when you and I really believe that Yahweh is inherently relational, interacts genuinely, and his primary disposition towards us is compassionate and gracious. When you and I come to really believe that, we will start to come to God with that kind of confidence, and we will launch ourselves at him. And we will vent sometimes, like Jonah. Guess what? God can handle it. And we will cry out in those places where we want rescue and help, like David. And God can deal with it. We will come like a child coming to our Father. And maybe this is a good way to transition, but I found myself thinking this past week that it's always appropriate on a Sunday to participate around the Lord's table. But on the Sunday when we get to talk about Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, friends, do you want a picture of how much God feels for you? You want a picture of God's compassion, of the length and depth of it? Do you want a picture of God's graciousness, the extent to which the parent is willing to go to put themselves in harm's way so that it doesn't have to happen to their children? It's this. I can't think of a more powerful picture. And so as we participate today, it's really all I want to leave you with. Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God. I want you to sense and be overwhelmed by the feeling that this God has for you. I would encourage those of you, I said, like, when you and I start to believe this, it will change the way we start to pray. So for those of you like me, who prayer is like one of those things we want to get to and we try to get to, but we struggle to get to. I talked about the 30-day challenge last Sunday. Some of you can keep going if you haven't. 30 days, you go, I can't do anything. 5 minutes, you can do 5 minutes. Set some time aside. The only two caveats are this. It needs to be a prioritized time. It has to be unhurried. So it has to have that space to be longer than 5 minutes if it needs. And launch yourself at him. What is really on your heart? What are you overjoyed about that you want to just say thanks for? What are you ticked about? Vent. Where do you want the gracious God to act in your life, in the life of your kids, in the life of your friends, in the life of your neighbors or coworkers? Cry out to him. Just be honest. And then pause for at least 1 minute and just say, Father, what might you want to say to me today? And just listen to the nudgings and the promptings that God, he will. I promise you he will. And because relationships are dynamic, it sometimes involves obedient steps on our part. So this is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to stop doing. It might just be a word of affirmation. I don't know. It will change you as you start to actually engage with this. Team, why don't you come up and join me? Worship team, you can hit the stage here as well. As we participate, Yahweh, just be overwhelmed by that. The compassionate, gracious God.